In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where every document carries the weight of centuries and every seal tells a story of power, something unprecedented happened that would send shockwaves through the halls of British royalty. On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in March 2024, a palace archivist noticed something that shouldn't exist: official correspondence bearing an emblem that had been secretly altered, switched, and manipulated in ways that defied all royal protocol. What started as routine paperwork review became a discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the inner workings of the modern monarchy. The woman behind this audacious act? None other than Catherine, the Princess of Wales, whose calculated move to replace Camilla's official emblem on crucial state documents would expose hidden tensions, secret power struggles, and a level of royal intrigue that would leave even the most seasoned palace observers completely stunned. The morning of March 15, 2024 began like any other for Margaret Thornberry, a dedicated archivist who had spent the better part of 2 decades meticulously organizing the endless stream of official correspondence that flowed through Buckingham Palace. At 62, she possessed the kind of sharp eye that came only from years of handling documents where every detail mattered, where a misplaced comma could spark diplomatic incidents, and where the authenticity of royal seals carried the weight of nations. Margaret had arrived at her cramped office in the palace's lower levels at precisely 7:30 in the morning, as she had done every working day for the past 18 years. The room, lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and document boxes, smelled perpetually of old paper and the lavender sachets she tucked between folders to ward off moisture damage. Her desk, though cluttered with papers awaiting review, was organized with military precision. Each stack had its purpose, each pile its place in the complex hierarchy of royal documentation. On this particular morning, Margaret was tasked with reviewing a batch of correspondence that had been flagged for archival processing. These were documents that had completed their active circulation within the palace and were now ready to be catalogued and stored for posterity. The batch included letters to foreign dignitaries, responses to parliamentary inquiries, and various ceremonial proclamations that had been issued over the previous month. As Margaret settled into her routine, adjusting her reading glasses and opening the first folder, she had no idea that she was about to uncover something that would shake the very foundations of royal protocol. The first few documents appeared entirely normal: letters bearing the appropriate seals, signatures in the expected places, and embossed letterheads that matched their supposed origins. But as she moved deeper into the pile, something began to feel wrong. It started with a subtle inconsistency that might have escaped a less experienced eye. A letter dated March 3rd, supposedly sent on behalf of Queen Camilla to the French ambassador regarding cultural exchanges, bore an emblem that seemed slightly off. The heraldic elements were correct, but there was something about the positioning, the size, perhaps even the coloring that didn't quite match Margaret's extensive knowledge of royal insignia. Margaret paused, removing her glasses to clean them before taking another look. She had handled thousands of documents bearing Camilla's official emblem over the years, and she prided herself on being able to spot even the most minute variations. This wasn't right. She reached for her magnifying glass and examined the emblem more closely. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. The emblem on the letter wasn't Camilla's at all. It was Catherine's, the Princess of Wales, but it had been modified in subtle ways to appear as though it belonged to the queen consort. The crown elements had been adjusted, the supporting heraldic elements rearranged, and the overall design manipulated with such skill that it would fool most casual observers. Margaret's hands began to tremble slightly as she reached for the next document in the pile. Another letter, this one dated March 5th, showed the same irregularity. And another. And another. As she worked through the stack, a pattern began to emerge that was so audacious, so unprecedented, that Margaret found herself struggling to believe what she was seeing. Someone had systematically replaced Camilla's official emblem on numerous pieces of correspondence with Catherine's modified version. But this wasn't the work of some external forger or a misguided clerk. The sophistication of the alterations, the access required to the original documents, and the intimate knowledge of royal heraldry all pointed to someone with significant influence within the palace walls. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of her discovery. Royal emblems weren't just decorative elements. They were legal signatures of authority, representations of the monarchy's power and legitimacy. To alter them was to tamper with the very essence of royal authority. In centuries past, such actions would have been considered treason. She carefully photographed each document with the palace-issued camera she used for archival purposes, her hands still shaking slightly as she documented the evidence. The implications were staggering. If these documents had been sent to their intended recipients with the wrong emblems, it could create confusion about the chain of command within the royal family, potentially undermining the authority of both women involved. But who could have orchestrated such an elaborate deception? The level of access required suggested someone with significant influence, someone who could move freely through the palace's administrative systems without arousing suspicion. Margaret's thoughts immediately turned to the small circle of individuals who would have both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to carry out such a plan. As she continued her examination, Margaret noticed that the altered documents all had one thing in common. They dealt with matters that traditionally fell under the purview of the queen consort: cultural initiatives, charitable patronages, diplomatic courtesies, all areas where Camilla had been working to establish her own identity and influence since becoming queen consort following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The more Margaret studied the documents, the more a disturbing picture began to emerge. This wasn't random vandalism or a clerk's mistake. This was a deliberate, systematic campaign to substitute Catherine's authority for Camilla's in official correspondence. But why would someone go to such extraordinary lengths to create this deception? Margaret glanced at the clock on her wall and realized she had been examining the documents for over 3 hours. Her usual efficiency had been completely derailed by this unprecedented discovery. She needed to report this to her supervisor, but she also knew that once she did, there would be no going back. This information would travel up the palace hierarchy like wildfire, potentially reaching the highest levels of the royal household. She reached for her phone to call her immediate supervisor, Harold Wickham, the chief archivist, but hesitated. Harold was a good man, but he was also someone who avoided controversy at all costs. Margaret knew that he would immediately want to escalate this to the private secretary's office, and from there, it would be out of her hands entirely. Before making that call, Margaret decided to examine the remaining documents in the batch more carefully. She needed to understand the full scope of what she had discovered. As she worked through the remaining papers, the pattern became even clearer. Nearly 30 documents showed evidence of emblem substitution, spanning a period of approximately 6 weeks. The technical skill required to make these alterations was impressive. Someone had carefully removed Camilla's original emblems and replaced them with Catherine's modified versions, using techniques that left minimal evidence of tampering. The paper showed no signs of damage, the adhesives used were professional grade, and the color matching was nearly perfect. Margaret found herself admiring the craftsmanship, even as she was horrified by the implications. This wasn't the work of an amateur. Someone with extensive knowledge of document restoration and heraldic design had carried out this operation. But more troubling still was the question of motive. As the morning progressed, Margaret began to notice other irregularities in the documents. Subtle changes in language, minor adjustments to diplomatic protocols, and small modifications to the traditional formulaic phrases used in royal correspondence. It was as if someone had been testing the waters, seeing how far they could push the boundaries before anyone noticed. The lunch hour came and went without Margaret leaving her office. She was too absorbed in her investigation to think about food. By mid-afternoon, she had compiled a comprehensive list of the altered documents and had begun to trace their origins through the palace's internal tracking system. What she discovered was even more shocking than the alterations themselves. The documents all traced back to a single source within the palace administration, the office of the Princess of Wales. Catherine herself, it appeared, was not just aware of the emblem substitutions, but was potentially the architect of the entire operation. Margaret sat back in her chair, removing her glasses and rubbing her tired eyes. The implications of what she had discovered were staggering. Catherine, one of the most popular members of the royal family, had apparently been engaged in a systematic campaign to undermine Camilla's authority by substituting her own emblem on official correspondence. But why would she take such an enormous risk? Catherine's position within the royal family was secure, her public approval ratings were consistently high, and she had her own well-established areas of influence and patronage. What could possibly motivate her to engage in such a dangerous game of royal one-upmanship? As Margaret prepared to finally make the call to Harold Wickham, she realized that she was about to set in motion a series of events that could potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. The relationship between Catherine and Camilla had always been a subject of intense media speculation, but if this discovery became public, it would confirm the worst suspicions about rivalry and conflict within the royal family. The phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed Harold's extension. She knew that once this conversation began, there would be no controlling where it led. Palace protocol demanded that she report her findings, but she also understood that doing so would thrust her into the center of what could become the biggest royal scandal in decades. Harold answered on the second ring, his voice carrying its usual tone of bureaucratic efficiency. Margaret took a deep breath and began to explain what she had discovered. Watching as the afternoon sun slanted through her small office window, casting long shadows across the documents that were about to change everything. As she spoke, she could hear Harold's breathing becoming more rapid, could sense his growing alarm even through the phone line. When she finished her initial explanation, there was a long silence before Harold finally spoke. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you absolutely certain about what you're telling me?" Margaret looked down at the stack of evidence spread across her desk, at the photographs she had taken, at the detailed notes she had compiled over the course of the morning. There was no doubt, no room for error or misinterpretation. "I'm certain, Harold," she replied. "Someone has been systematically altering royal correspondence, and all evidence points to this being orchestrated from within the Princess of Wales's office." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Margaret could almost hear Harold's mind racing, calculating the implications, considering the protocols that would need to be followed. Finally, he spoke again. "Don't discuss this with anyone else," he said firmly. "Secure all the documents and meet me in conference room C in 30 minutes. And, Margaret, bring everything. We're going to need to present a complete picture to the private secretary's office." As Margaret hung up the phone and began gathering her evidence, she realized that her quiet life as a palace archivist was about to become infinitely more complicated. She had uncovered something that would force the royal family to confront uncomfortable truths about power, rivalry, and the delicate balance that held the monarchy together. The discovery phase was complete, but Margaret had a sinking feeling that what came next would be far more challenging than anything she had ever experienced in her 18 years of service to the crown. Conference Room C in Buckingham Palace was a windowless space typically reserved for sensitive administrative meetings, its walls lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs who seemed to watch disapprovingly over whatever proceedings took place below them. When Margaret Thornbury entered the room at precisely 4 o'clock that afternoon, she found Harold Wickham already seated at the mahogany table, his usually composed demeanor betrayed by the nervous energy that radiated from his fidgeting hands. Harold was a man who had built his career on avoiding drama, on maintaining the smooth operation of the palace's vast archival systems without drawing attention to himself or his department. At 55, he had survived 3 decades of royal service by being thorough, discreet, and utterly reliable. But as Margaret spread her evidence across the conference table, Harold realized that his carefully cultivated reputation for managing quiet competence was about to be severely tested. The documents Margaret had discovered looked even more damning when laid out systematically under the room's harsh fluorescent lighting. The pattern of substitution was clear, the timeline evident, and the implications impossible to ignore. Harold studied each piece of evidence with the methodical precision that had made him indispensable to the palace's administrative machinery. But Margaret could see the growing concern in his eyes. "This is unprecedented, Margaret," Harold began, then stopped, seeming to search for words adequate to describe what they were facing. "This is unprecedented. In all my years here, I have never encountered anything remotely like this situation we find ourselves confronting today." Margaret nodded grimly. She had spent the time between their phone call and this meeting reviewing palace protocols for handling potential security breaches, but nothing in the official procedures seemed to address the situation they now faced. "How do you report that a senior member of the royal family appears to have been systematically undermining another senior royal's authority through document manipulation?" Harold reached for his phone to contact the private secretary's office, but Margaret placed her hand on his arm. "Before we escalate this matter further," she said quietly, Shouldn't we be absolutely certain about what we are alleging here? Once we make this call, there is no controlling where this information goes or what consequences might follow. Harold paused, his finger hovering over the phone's keypad. Margaret was right, of course. The private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, was not someone who took allegations lightly, particularly ones that could potentially damage the reputation of the royal family in ways that might prove irreparable. But Harold also knew that delaying could be even more dangerous if the situation was as serious as it appeared to be based on their initial findings. "What do you suggest we do at this point?" Harold asked, setting down his phone and looking directly at Margaret for guidance. Margaret had been thinking about this question since their conversation earlier in the day. "We need independent verification of our findings," she said with conviction. "Someone with expertise in document analysis, who can confirm that these alterations were made deliberately and skillfully, not accidentally or through some innocent mistake. We also need to understand the timeline better, specifically when exactly these changes were made and by whom they might have been executed." Harold considered this approach carefully. It made sense from a procedural standpoint, but it also meant bringing additional people into what was already a highly sensitive situation that required the utmost discretion. Still, Margaret was absolutely right that they needed to be completely certain before making accusations that could potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. "I know someone who might be able to help us," Harold said finally. "Dr. Sarah Chen. She is a forensic document analyst who has worked with the palace before on various authentication issues. She is completely trustworthy and has the highest security clearance available for this type of sensitive work." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. Having an independent expert examine the evidence would either confirm their suspicions beyond any doubt or reveal some innocent explanation they had somehow missed in their analysis. "How quickly can we arrange to get her here to examine these materials?" Harold was already reaching for his phone again. "Sarah works from home most days, so her schedule tends to be quite flexible. If I explain the urgency of the situation without going into too much specific detail, she could probably be here within the hour to begin her examination." While they waited for Dr. Chen to arrive at the palace, Harold and Margaret continued their own examination of the evidence they had compiled. They created a detailed timeline of all the altered documents, cross-referencing the dates with Catherine's official schedule to see if there were any meaningful correlations between her activities and the timing of the alterations. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply troubling to contemplate. The pattern of alterations seemed to correspond directly with periods when Catherine was most active in areas traditionally associated with the Queen Consort's role and responsibilities. When Camilla was scheduled to host foreign dignitaries at official palace functions, Catherine's emblem mysteriously appeared on related correspondence and planning documents. When cultural initiatives were being discussed and developed, Catherine's modified seal showed up on planning documents and official communications. It was as if someone was systematically inserting Catherine into conversations and decisions where she had no official role or authority. Sarah Chen arrived at the palace at 5:15 in the afternoon, her arrival announced by a discreet knock on the conference room door. She was a petite woman in her 40s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of intense focus that came from years of examining documents for signs of fraud, deception, and historical authenticity. Harold had worked with her on several previous occasions when questions arose about the authenticity of historical documents in the extensive royal collection. After the necessary security protocols were completed and Dr. Chen had been properly briefed on the confidential nature of her consultation, Harold and Margaret provided her with a comprehensive overview of their discovery. They watched her expression remain carefully neutral as they explained the situation in detail, but Margaret could see the analyst's professional interest sharpen noticeably when they showed her the actual documents in question. Dr. Chen examined the first altered document under a high-powered magnifying glass she produced from her well-organized equipment case. The room fell completely silent except for the soft scratch of her pen as she made detailed notes on a legal pad, documenting her observations with scientific precision. After several minutes of careful examination, she looked up with an expression that confirmed Margaret's worst fears about the seriousness of their discovery. "This is extremely sophisticated work," Dr. Chen said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had examined thousands of potentially fraudulent documents over her career. Whoever executed these alterations has extensive knowledge of paper composition, adhesive properties, and color matching techniques. These are definitely not random acts of vandalism or amateur attempts at forgery. This was carefully planned and executed by someone with considerable skill and access to professional-grade materials. Harold leaned forward across the table, his concern evident in his posture. Can you determine specifically how these alterations were made? What techniques and materials were used? Dr. Chen nodded, pulling additional specialized equipment from her case with practiced efficiency. I will need to run some detailed chemical tests to be completely certain about the specific methods used. But based on my initial examination, I believe the original emblems were carefully removed using a combination of precisely controlled heat and solvent techniques, then replaced with the substituted versions using methods that would minimize any obvious signs of tampering. The new emblems were affixed using archival quality adhesives that wouldn't cause long-term damage to the paper or leave obvious traces of alteration. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as she listened to Dr. Chen's analysis. The level of sophistication the expert was describing confirmed beyond any doubt that this wasn't the work of some disgruntled clerk or outside troublemaker seeking to cause mischief. This required access to restricted areas, specialized expertise in document restoration, and resources that were available only to a very small number of people within the palace hierarchy. As Dr. Susan Chen continued her painstaking analysis over the next hour, she began to uncover additional details that painted an even more concerning picture of the scope and sophistication of the deception. The substituted emblems aren't crude forgeries or simple copies, she explained, holding one document up to examine it under specialized lighting. They are based on genuine heraldic elements from official sources, but they have been modified in subtle ways that would be meaningful only to someone with intimate knowledge of royal protocol and heraldic tradition. Harold asked the question that had been weighing heavily on all their minds since the beginning of this investigation. Based on your professional analysis, is there any way to determine who might have had the knowledge and access necessary to carry out these alterations with this level of skill and sophistication? Doctor? Chen set down her magnifying glass and looked directly at both Harold and Margaret, her expression grave. Based on the sophisticated nature of the work, the high-quality materials that were used, and the intimate knowledge of royal heraldry that would be required to execute these modifications, we are looking at someone with significant resources, expertise, and access to restricted palace areas. This is not something that could be accomplished quickly or secretly in a standard office environment. It would require specialized equipment, high-quality archival materials, and considerable time to complete each alteration properly. The implications of Dr. Chen's professional analysis were crystal clear, even though she was appropriately careful not to make direct accusations without additional evidence. The pool of people with the necessary access, knowledge, and resources to carry out such an elaborate scheme was extremely small. Margaret found herself thinking about the complex layout of the palace, about who had unrestricted access to which areas, and about who might have both the motivation and the means to carry out such an elaborate and dangerous scheme. As the evening wore on and the natural light faded outside the windowless conference room, Chen completed her preliminary analysis and provided Harold with a comprehensive written report outlining her professional findings. The document was carefully worded to maintain appropriate scientific objectivity, but it was devastating in its conclusions. The alterations were definitely deliberate rather than accidental, extremely sophisticated in their execution, and carried out over an extended period of time with access to professional-grade materials and equipment. Someone with considerable resources and expertise had systematically tampered with official royal correspondence in ways that could undermine the constitutional authority of the monarchy. Harold knew he could no longer justify delaying contact with the private secretary's office. The evidence was overwhelming in its implications, and the potential consequences of further delay were too serious to contemplate responsibly. He excused Dr. Chen with instructions to prepare a more detailed technical report for official use, then turned to Margaret with an expression that reflected the gravity of their situation. "We have reached the point where we must call Sir Clive," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what they were about to set in motion. "This has gone far beyond anything we can handle appropriately at our administrative level, and the constitutional implications are too serious to ignore." Margaret nodded her agreement. though she felt a deep sense of unease about what would inevitably happen next. Once Sir Clive Alderton became directly involved in the investigation, the situation would take on a life of its own beyond their control. The private secretary had direct access to King Charles and would be constitutionally obligated to brief him immediately on these findings. From that point forward, the situation would likely escalate rapidly through channels they could not influence or control. Harold placed the crucial call to Sir Clive's office, reaching the private secretary's deputy, Amanda Richardson, who confirmed that Sir Clive was still working in the palace despite the late hour. She agreed to arrange an immediate meeting in Sir Clive's private office, emphasizing the extremely sensitive nature of the situation and the need for absolute discretion in handling the matter. As they gathered their evidence and prepared to leave Conference Room C for what might be the last time as the only people aware of this crisis, Margaret took one final look at the documents spread across the table. These pieces of paper, which had seemed so routine and innocent during her morning archival work, had become the catalyst for what could potentially become a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. The careful alterations, the systematic substitutions, the deliberate undermining of royal authority represented a level of internal conflict within the royal family that went far beyond mere personality clashes or the kind of media speculation that typically surrounded royal relationships. The walk to Sir Clive's office took them through some of the palace's most formal corridors, past portraits of monarchs who had faced their own crises and constitutional challenges throughout British history. Margaret found herself wondering how future historians would judge the events they were about to set in motion. Would this be seen as a necessary intervention to preserve royal authority and constitutional stability, or as the beginning of a scandal that irreparably damaged the monarchy's reputation and public standing? Sir Clive Alderton's office reflected his position as one of the most powerful and influential people in the royal household. The room was elegantly appointed, with antique furniture and carefully selected artwork that spoke to centuries of royal tradition and constitutional continuity. But it was also equipped with the sophisticated modern communications technology necessary for managing a 21st-century constitutional monarchy. Sir Clive himself was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s, with carefully maintained silver hair and the kind of authoritative bearing that came from decades of high-level diplomatic service and constitutional responsibility. When Harold and Margaret entered the office, Sir Clive was standing behind his imposing desk, clearly having been briefed by his deputy on the general nature of their concerns. His expression was carefully controlled in the manner of someone trained in diplomatic discretion, but Margaret could see the underlying tension in his posture. As one of King Charles's most trusted advisors and constitutional counselors, Sir Clive understood better than most the potential implications of serious internal royal conflicts. "Please, take your seats," Sir Clive said, gesturing toward chairs that had been arranged in front of his desk in preparation for their meeting. "Amanda has given me a brief preliminary overview of your concerns, but I need you to walk me through exactly what you have discovered, leaving out no details that might be relevant to understanding the full scope of this situation." Harold took the lead in presenting their findings, drawing on his decades of archival experience to present the evidence with the methodical precision that had made him an effective and trusted administrator. He laid out the timeline of their discovery, showed Sir Clive the photographic evidence they had compiled, and presented Dr. Chen's preliminary professional report with its devastating conclusions about the deliberate nature of the document alterations. Throughout Harold's comprehensive presentation, Sir Clive remained silent and attentive, occasionally making brief notes but never interrupting the flow of information. His diplomatic training had taught him the importance of gathering all available information before making any judgments or decisions about appropriate responses. When Harold finished his presentation, Sir Clive leaned back in his chair and studied the evidence spread before him for several long moments. Margaret could see him processing the constitutional implications, calculating the potential consequences for the monarchy, and considering the various courses of action available to him in such an unprecedented situation. "This is extremely serious in its potential implications," Sir Clive said finally, his voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority. "If your analysis is correct, and I have no reason to doubt Dr. Chen's professional expertise, we are dealing with a deliberate attempt to undermine the constitutional authority of the Queen Consort by systematically substituting the Princess of Wales's emblem on official correspondence. The constitutional implications alone are staggering," and the potential for damage to the monarchy's reputation could be irreparable if this situation is not handled with the utmost care and discretion. Margaret felt compelled to speak up, despite her awareness that she was addressing one of the most powerful people in the royal hierarchy. Sir Clive, we want to emphasize that we have not drawn any definitive conclusions about who might be ultimately responsible for these alterations. We are simply reporting what we have discovered in the course of our routine archival work and presenting the professional analysis we have obtained.
Sir Clive nodded appreciatively at Margaret's caution. I understand and appreciate your professional restraint, and it is entirely appropriate given the gravity of the situation.
However, we cannot ignore the obvious implications of your findings, regardless of how uncomfortable they might be. The level of access required to accomplish these alterations, the sophisticated nature of the techniques used, and the systematic pattern evident in the timeline all point unavoidably towards someone with considerable influence and resources within the palace hierarchy. Harold cleared his throat nervously, a gesture that reflected his deep discomfort with the situation they had uncovered. What are the appropriate next steps, Sir Clive? How do we proceed responsibly with something of this constitutional magnitude? Sir Clive stood and walked to the tall window overlooking the palace gardens, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reflected both his diplomatic training and the weight of the decision he was about to make. The evening light was rapidly fading, casting long shadows across the carefully manicured lawns where tourists and photographers often gathered during daylight hours, hoping for a glimpse of royal activity. I will need to brief His Majesty immediately, Sir Clive said without turning around from the window. This is not something that can appropriately wait until our regular morning meeting. We will also need to launch a comprehensive internal investigation which will unfortunately require bringing in additional security personnel and administrative staff who can be trusted with this level of sensitive information. Margaret felt her heart sink as she contemplated what Sir Clive's decision would mean for her quiet, methodical work life. The peaceful, contemplative environment of archival management that she had grown to love over her years of service was about to be replaced by intense scrutiny, formal interrogations, and security reviews conducted by people far above her administrative level. Sir Clive turned back to face them, his expression reflecting the constitutional gravity of the situation they were confronting. I want to be absolutely clear about something that cannot be negotiated or compromised. This information cannot leave this room until we have decided collectively how to proceed with the investigation and any necessary confrontations. The potential for irreparable damage to the monarchy's reputation and constitutional authority is enormous, and we must be extremely careful about how we handle every aspect of this situation. Both Harold and Margaret nodded their understanding and agreement, but Margaret couldn't help wondering privately how long such explosive and unprecedented information could realistically be contained within the palace walls. The royal household was filled with hundreds of dedicated people, and human nature dictated that people would eventually talk about unusual activities and investigations. Once word of this investigation began to spread through the palace's informal networks, it would be nearly impossible to control the flow of information or prevent potentially damaging speculation. As they prepared to leave Sir Clive's office and return to their normal duties while awaiting further instructions, the private secretary made one final and crucial request. I want both of you to prepare comprehensive written reports of your findings and your entire investigation process, including every detail you can recall. Include everything in your reports, every document you examined, every conversation you had about the situation, every decision you made during your investigation. We are going to need a complete and unassailable record of how this situation was discovered and initially handled, because that record may become crucial evidence in whatever proceedings follow. Walking back through the palace corridors toward their respective offices, Margaret felt the enormous weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She had begun this day as a quiet, anonymous archivist working in comfortable relative obscurity within the vast palace bureaucracy. Now she had become a key witness in what could potentially develop into one of the most significant royal scandals in modern British history. The documents she had discovered during her routine morning work had opened a door into constitutional crisis that could never be closed again. And she wasn't at all sure she was prepared for whatever challenges and consequences lay waiting on the other side of that door. The morning of March 16th brought an unprecedented level of activity to the normally serene administrative corridors of Buckingham Palace. By 7 a.m., Sir Clive Alderton had already convened an emergency meeting with the palace's most senior staff members, including the Master of the Household. the keeper of the privy purse, and the head of palace security. The gravity of the situation was evident in the unusual silence that had fallen over departments typically buzzing with morning preparations. King Charles had been briefed on the situation during his regular morning meeting with Sir Clive at 6:30. The king's reaction, according to those present, had been one of profound concern rather than anger. Charles had spent decades navigating the complex dynamics of royal family relationships, but even his extensive experience hadn't prepared him for allegations of systematic document manipulation between two of the monarchy's most prominent figures. Meanwhile, in her modest apartment within the palace complex, Margaret Thornbury was struggling with insomnia that had plagued her since discovering the altered documents. She had spent the night reviewing every detail of her investigation, wondering if there was anything she had missed, any innocent explanation that could account for the evidence she had uncovered. But each time she returned to the same conclusion: someone with significant access and expertise had deliberately undermined Queen Camilla's authority. The relationship between Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Queen Camilla had been a subject of intense media speculation since Catherine joined the royal family in 2011. Initially, their interactions appeared cordial, even warm, with both women seemingly committed to supporting their respective roles within the monarchy. However, insiders had long whispered about underlying tensions that went far beyond the usual challenges of integrating a new member into the royal hierarchy. The source of these tensions was complex and multifaceted. Catherine, as the future queen consort, occupied a unique position within the royal family structure. Her marriage to Prince William, the heir to the throne, meant that she would eventually hold the same position that Camilla now occupied. This dynamic created an inherent tension about precedent's influence and the direction of the monarchy's future. Camilla's own journey to acceptance within the royal family had been arduous. Her relationship with then Prince Charles during his marriage to Princess Diana had made her one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history. Even after her marriage to Charles in 2005 and her gradual rehabilitation in public opinion, Camilla remained acutely aware of the fragility of her position. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022 and Charles's ascension to the throne had finally given Camilla the security of being queen consort, but it had also intensified the scrutiny of her role and influence. Catherine, in contrast, had enjoyed widespread public approval from the moment she entered the royal family. Her background as a commoner, her apparent devotion to William and their children, and her graceful handling of royal duties had made her one of the most popular members of the royal family. This popularity, combined with her future role as queen consort, had given Catherine considerable soft power within the royal hierarchy. Amanda Foster, a historian specializing in modern royal dynamics who had been quietly consulted by palace officials in the past, understood these tensions better than most. When Sir Clive's office contacted her on the morning of March 16th, requesting an urgent consultation on royal protocol and hierarchy, she immediately recognized the potential significance of the call. Dr. Foster arrived at the palace at 10 a.m., entering through a discreet side entrance typically used by official visitors who preferred to avoid media attention. She was escorted directly to a small meeting room where she found Sir Clive waiting with several other senior palace officials she didn't recognize. "Dr. Foster, thank you for coming on such short notice," Sir Clive began, his usual diplomatic composure showing signs of strain. "We have a situation that requires your expertise in royal protocol and historical precedent." Without revealing the specific details of the Emblem substitutions, Sir Clive outlined a hypothetical scenario involving conflicts between senior royal family members over matters of precedence and authority. Dr. Same. Foster listened carefully, her historian's instincts telling her that this was far from a theoretical discussion. "The dynamics you're describing," Dr. Foster said thoughtfully, "have historical precedence, though not in exactly the same form. The relationship between a current queen consort and a future queen consort is inherently complex, particularly when both are strong personalities with their own visions for the monarchy." Sir Clive leaned forward. "What would you say about the constitutional implications of one senior royal attempting to substitute their authority for another's in official matters?" "Doctor?" Foster's expression grew serious. "That would be extremely problematic from both constitutional and practical perspectives. Royal authority is not something that can be borrowed or assumed informally. It must be properly delegated and acknowledged through established protocols." As Dr. Foster spoke, Sir Clive found himself thinking about the broader implications of the situation they were facing. The emblem substitutions weren't just about paperwork or protocol violations. They represented a fundamental challenge to the carefully maintained balance of power within the royal family. While these high-level consultations were taking place, the investigation into the document alterations was expanding. Palace security had been quietly reviewing access logs for areas where the alterations could have taken place. They had also begun discreet interviews with staff members who had been involved in processing the affected correspondence. Sarah Mitchell, a junior secretary in Catherine's office, found herself summoned for an interview that morning. Sarah had worked for the Princess of Wales for 3 years and took pride in the efficiency and discretion with which she handled her responsibilities. When she was escorted to a small office she had never seen before and found herself facing 2 serious-looking men in suits, her first thought was that someone had made a terrible mistake. "Miss Mitchell," the senior investigator began, "we need to ask you some questions about document processing procedures in the princess's office. This is part of a routine review of administrative protocols." Sarah nodded, though she noticed that nothing about the situation felt routine. The questions began innocuously enough: her daily responsibilities, the typical workflow for correspondence, the security measures in place for handling official documents. But gradually, the questioning became more specific and concerning. "Have you ever been asked to make modifications to documents after they've been initially prepared?" one investigator asked. Sarah thought carefully. "Sometimes the princess requests changes to letters or statements before they're finalized. That's quite normal." "What about changes to official seals or emblems?" This question puzzled Sarah. "I wouldn't have the authority to make changes to official emblems. That would be handled at a much higher level, and I certainly wouldn't have access to the materials or equipment necessary for that kind of work." The investigators made notes and continued their questioning, but Sarah could sense that her answers weren't providing them with what they were looking for. As the interview concluded, she was reminded of the importance of discretion and asked not to discuss the meeting with anyone. Similar interviews were being conducted throughout the palace, as investigators worked to map out who had access to what areas and what capabilities. The picture that emerged was troubling. Very few people had both the access and expertise necessary to carry out the document alterations, and most of those people were in positions of significant trust and responsibility. By midday, Sir Clive had received preliminary reports from the various investigative teams. The evidence continued to point in an uncomfortable direction, and the time was rapidly approaching when direct confrontation would become inevitable. Before taking that step, however, Sir Clive needed to understand more about the motivations that might drive such unprecedented behavior. Foster's analysis proved crucial in this regard. Based on her study of historical royal dynamics and her understanding of contemporary palace politics, she provided Sir Clive with a framework for understanding the pressures and tensions that might lead to the situation they were facing. The position of Princess of Wales has always carried unique challenges, Dr. Foster explained during a private consultation with Sir Clive that afternoon. Catherine knows that she will eventually hold the position that Camilla currently occupies, but she has no clear timeline for when that transition will occur. Meanwhile, she must balance deference to the current queen consort with her own growing influence and popularity. Sir Clive found this analysis illuminating but also deeply concerning. "Are you suggesting that impatience with the current arrangement might motivate someone to take irregular actions?" "Doctor," Foster chose her words carefully, "I'm suggesting that the structural tensions inherent in the current situation create pressures that might lead to boundary testing behavior. If someone felt that their legitimate authority was being overlooked or constrained, they might be tempted to assert that authority through unofficial channels." This conversation took place as news of the investigation began to spread through the palace's informal networks. Despite all efforts to maintain secrecy, the unusual level of activity and the discreet interviews being conducted had not gone unnoticed. Staff members who had worked in the palace for years understood that something significant was happening, even if they didn't know the specific details. Lady Jennifer Morrison, one of Camilla's longest-serving ladies-in-waiting, became aware of the situation when she was asked to provide access to correspondence files dating back several weeks. Lady Yennefer had served the royal family for over 15 years and had developed an instinct for recognizing when normal palace routines were being disrupted by serious problems. When she was eventually briefed on the general nature of the investigation, Lady Yennefer's reaction was one of shock and concern. She had worked closely with Camilla during her transition to Queen Consort and understood how carefully Camilla had worked to establish her authority and credibility in her new role.
The idea that someone might be systematically undermining those efforts was deeply troubling. Her Majesty has worked so hard to earn respect in this role, Lady Yennefer confided to Sir Clive during her briefing. If there's been deliberate interference with her official correspondence, she needs to know about it immediately. This raised another complex issue for Sir Clive to consider. At what point should Camilla herself be informed about the investigation? And how should she be told about allegations that pointed toward Catherine as the likely perpetrator? As the day progressed, pressure began mounting for direct action. The evidence was substantial, the investigation had reached the limits of what could be accomplished through discreet inquiries, and the risk of leaks was increasing with each person who became aware of the situation. King Charles requested an updated briefing at 4 p.m., and Sir Clive found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to recommend a course of action that would potentially create a major confrontation within the royal family. The king listened to the update with his characteristic thoughtfulness, asking pointed questions about the evidence and the investigation process. "What are our options at this point?" the king asked when Sir Clive had finished his briefing. Sir Clive had been considering this question throughout the day. "We have 3 basic choices, Your Majesty. We can continue the investigation and hope to find more conclusive evidence. We can confront the Princess of Wales directly with what we've discovered, or we can attempt to address the situation through informal channels and hope to prevent any further incidents." King Charles was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of each option. As someone who had spent his entire life navigating complex family dynamics under intense public scrutiny, he understood better than most the potential consequences of mishandling this situation. "What does your instinct tell you about the princess's likely reaction if confronted directly?" the king asked. This was perhaps the most difficult question Sir Clive had to answer. Catherine had always been cooperative and professional in her dealings with palace administration, but the current situation was unlike anything they had faced before. "I believe she would be shocked and defensive initially, Your Majesty. But I also believe she's too intelligent and too committed to the monarchy to deny clear evidence if it's presented properly." The king made his decision with the deliberate care that characterized his approach to all major choices. "Schedule a meeting with the Princess of Wales for tomorrow morning. I want you to present the evidence directly and give her an opportunity to respond. But I also want Queen Camilla briefed on the situation before that meeting takes place." As Sir Clive left the king's private study, he realized that the next 24 hours would likely determine whether this crisis could be contained within the royal family or whether it would explode into a public scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation for years to come. The careful balance that had maintained royal unity was about to face its most serious test in decades. The morning of March 17th dawned gray and overcast, with thick clouds hanging low over Buckingham Palace like an ominous curtain. The weather seemed to reflect the tension that had settled over the palace's senior staff as they prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most delicate and potentially explosive confrontations in recent royal history. Sir Clive Alderton had spent much of the previous evening preparing for his meeting with Catherine, Princess of Wales. He had reviewed every piece of evidence multiple times, consulted with legal advisors about the constitutional implications of the situation, and even practiced different approaches for presenting the allegations. Despite his decades of experience handling sensitive royal matters, Sir Clive found himself unusually nervous about the upcoming encounter. At 8 a.m., Queen Camilla was briefed on the investigation's findings in the privacy of her personal sitting room. The Queen Consort's reaction was one of stunned disbelief, followed by what witnesses described as controlled fury. Camilla had worked tirelessly to establish her credibility and authority in her role, and the idea that someone had been systematically undermining her efforts struck at the very heart of her professional identity. "Are you absolutely certain about this evidence?" Camilla asked Sir Clive, her voice steady but tight with emotion. "There's no possibility of a mistake or misinterpretation?" Sir Clive had anticipated this question and was prepared with a thorough response. "Your Majesty, we've had the documents examined by an independent forensic expert, and her findings are conclusive. The alterations were deliberate, sophisticated, and systematic. There's no question that someone with considerable access and expertise has been substituting emblems on official correspondence." Camilla walked to the window of her sitting room, looking out over the palace gardens where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom despite the gloomy weather. The irony wasn't lost on her that this crisis was unfolding just as she was beginning to feel truly settled in her role as queen consort. "What does Charles know about this?" she asked without turning around. "His Majesty has been fully briefed and has authorized me to confront the Princess of Wales directly this morning," Sir Clive replied. "He's also made it clear that this matter must be resolved quickly and discreetly." Camilla finally turned back to face Sir Clive, and he could see the determination that had helped her survive decades of public scrutiny and criticism. "I want to be present when you meet with Catherine," she said firmly. Sir Clive had expected this request, but he also knew it would complicate an already difficult situation. "Your Majesty, I'm not sure that's advisable. Direct confrontation between you and the princess might make it more difficult to reach a resolution." "Clive," Camilla said, using his first name in a way that emphasized both their long working relationship and her royal authority. "Someone has been deliberately undermining my position and authority. I have every right to hear Catherine's explanation directly." Sir Clive realized that arguing with Camilla on this point would be futile. The queen consort had a well-deserved reputation for determination, and when she made up her mind about something, she rarely changed it. "Very well, Your Majesty. I'll modify the meeting arrangements accordingly." Meanwhile, Catherine was beginning her morning routine at Adelaide Cottage, the family home she shared with Prince William and their 3 children. She had no idea of the storm that was about to break over her, though she had noticed some unusual activity at the palace over the past 2 days. Staff members seemed more tense than usual, and there had been several meetings and consultations that were being conducted with unusual secrecy. Catherine had built her reputation within the royal family on her reliability, her discretion, and her unwavering commitment to her duties. The idea that she might be at the center of a major crisis would have seemed absurd to anyone who knew her well, yet the evidence that Sir Clive had compiled painted a picture of systematic deception that was impossible to ignore. At 10 a.m., Catherine received a call from Sir Clive's office requesting her presence at Buckingham Palace for an urgent meeting regarding administrative matters. The vague nature of the request was unusual, but Catherine had learned over her years in the royal family that palace business often involved unexpected meetings and last-minute schedule changes. Catherine arrived at the palace at 11 a.m., entering through the private entrance typically used by senior family members. She was escorted to the same conference room where Margaret Thornbury had first presented her findings, though Catherine had no way of knowing the significance of that location. When Catherine entered the room and found not only Sir Clive waiting for her but also Queen Camilla, she immediately sensed that this was not a routine administrative meeting. The tension in the room was palpable, and both older adults looked unusually formal and serious. "Please sit down, Your Royal Highness," Sir Clive said, gesturing to a chair across from where he and Camilla were seated. The use of Catherine's full title, rather than the more casual address typically used in private meetings, was another indication that this was not an ordinary encounter. Catherine took her seat and looked expectantly at Sir Clive, though she noticed that Camilla was studying her with an intensity that made her increasingly uncomfortable. "What's this about?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying the slight edge that appeared when she sensed potential conflict. Sir Clive had rehearsed this moment multiple times, but he still found himself struggling to find the right words. "Your Royal Highness, we need to discuss some irregularities that have been discovered in official palace correspondence. Specifically, we found evidence of systematic alterations to documents that bear official royal emblems." Catherine's expression didn't change, but Sir Clive thought he detected a slight tightening around her eyes. "What sort of alterations?" Rather than answering immediately, Sir Clive opened the folder he had placed on the table and began laying out the altered documents. Catherine watched this process with apparent curiosity, but as the evidence accumulated in front of her, her expression began to shift from interest to concern. "These documents," Sir Clive continued, "show clear evidence that Queen Camilla's official emblem has been systematically removed and replaced with a modified version of your emblem, Your Royal Highness. The alterations were made with considerable skill and sophistication, and they cover a period of approximately 6 weeks. The silence that followed Sir Clive's statement stretched on for nearly a full minute. Catherine stared at the documents spread across the table, and observers later described her expression as one of genuine shock and confusion. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Are you suggesting that I'm responsible for these predators and their alterations? Camilla spoke for the first time since Catherine had entered the room. The evidence certainly points in that direction, doesn't it? Catherine looked directly at Camilla, and for the first time in their relationship, there was open tension between them. I had nothing to do with any document alterations, Catherine said firmly. I don't know what's happened here, but I certainly didn't authorize or participate in changing anyone's official emblems. Sir Clive had expected this denial, but he was prepared with additional evidence. Your Royal Highness, our investigation has traced these documents back to your office. The level of access required, the sophisticated nature of the alterations, and the intimate knowledge of royal heraldry all suggest involvement from someone with significant resources and expertise. Catherine felt the weight of the allegations settling on her shoulders. She realized that she was being accused not just of a prank or a minor protocol violation, but of something that could be seen as a direct challenge to royal authority and possibly even treason. I want to see everything, Catherine said, her voice gaining strength. Every piece of evidence, every document, every analysis. If someone has been doing this in my name or from my office, I need to understand exactly what's happened. Over the next hour, Sir Clive and Camilla walked Catherine through the entire investigation. They showed her Dr. Tua, Chen's forensic analysis, the timeline of alterations, the access logs that pointed to her office, and the pattern of substitutions that seemed to target Camilla's areas of responsibility. As the evidence accumulated, Catherine found herself in an impossible position. The facts clearly pointed to her involvement, yet she had no memory of authorizing or participating in any document alterations. She began to feel like she was trapped in a nightmare where she was being accused of crimes she couldn't remember committing. There has to be another explanation, Catherine insisted. Someone else must have had access to my office, or there's been a mistake in the investigation. I would never do something like this. Camilla's patience was beginning to wear thin. Catherine, the evidence is overwhelming. Rather than continuing to deny what's obviously true, perhaps you should explain why you felt it necessary to undermine my authority in this way. This direct challenge sparked something in Catherine that had been building throughout the meeting. Your authority? She responded, her voice carrying an edge that surprised everyone in the room. Camilla, I've spent years supporting your transition to Queen Consort, attending events with you, deferring to your precedents. Why would I suddenly decide to sabotage that relationship? Perhaps, Camilla replied coldly, because you've grown impatient with deferring to anyone. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Sir Clive realized that the conversation was moving away from the evidence and toward the underlying tensions that might have motivated the document alterations. While this psychological exploration might eventually prove useful, it was also dangerous territory that could lead to permanent damage to the relationship between the two women. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Sir Clive interrupted diplomatically. Perhaps we should focus on understanding what happened and how to prevent it from happening again, rather than speculating about motivations. But Catherine was no longer listening to diplomatic suggestions. The stress of the accusations, combined with what she perceived as unfair treatment from Camilla, had triggered a response that was uncharacteristic of her usually controlled demeanor. You want to know what I think happened? Catherine said, standing up from her chair. I think someone has been playing games with both of us. Someone wanted to create exactly this kind of conflict, and we're falling right into their trap. Camilla also stood, her own composure finally cracking. That's a convenient theory, Catherine, but it doesn't explain how documents from your office ended up with my emblem replaced by yours. Then maybe, Catherine replied, her voice rising, you should be asking who had access to my office rather than assuming I'm some kind of saboteur. The confrontation had reached a level of intensity that Sir Clive had hoped to avoid. Both women were now standing facing each other across the conference table, with years of suppressed tensions finally bubbling to the surface. Sir Clive stood as well, raising his hands in a gesture intended to calm the situation. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, I think we need to take a step back and approach this more systematically. Catherine, you're suggesting that someone else might have been responsible for these alterations. Do you have any specific theories about who might have had both the access and the motivation to carry out such a plan? Catherine paused, considering the question seriously for the first time since the meeting had begun. As her initial shock and defensive anger began to subside, she found herself thinking more analytically about the situation. "There are only a few people who would have had access to my office and the expertise to make these kinds of alterations," she said slowly. "But I can't believe any of them would do something like this without my knowledge." "Nevertheless," Sir Clive said gently, "we'll need to investigate that possibility thoroughly. In the meantime, we need to consider what steps should be taken to address the immediate situation." The immediate situation, as all three of them understood, was that the relationship between Catherine and Camilla had been severely damaged by the confrontation. Even if the document alterations could be explained or resolved, the accusations and counter-accusations that had been exchanged would be difficult to overcome. Camilla was the first to acknowledge this reality. "Regardless of who's ultimately responsible for these document alterations," she said, her voice returning to its normal, controlled tone, "we have a serious problem in terms of trust and communication." Catherine nodded reluctantly. "I agree. But Camilla, you have to understand that being accused of deliberately undermining you is incredibly hurtful. I've never done anything to suggest I don't respect your position." As the meeting concluded, Sir Clive realized that they had reached the end of what could be accomplished through direct confrontation. The next phase of resolving this crisis would require a different approach, one that focused on investigation rather than accusation, and on healing rather than blame. But as Catherine left the palace that afternoon, she carried with her the knowledge that her relationship with Camilla had been fundamentally changed. The trust and mutual respect that had characterized their interactions for years had been replaced by suspicion and resentment. Whatever the truth about the document alterations, the confrontation itself had created wounds that might never fully heal. The days following the confrontation between Catherine and Camilla brought an atmosphere of unprecedented tension to Buckingham Palace. Staff members who had worked within the royal household for decades remarked privately that they had never experienced such a palpable sense of crisis, even during the most challenging periods of the previous reign. The usually smooth operation of royal duties continued, but underneath the surface everyone could sense that something fundamental had shifted. King Charles, who had hoped that direct confrontation would lead to quick resolution, found himself dealing with a situation that had grown more complex rather than simpler. The meeting between Catherine and Camilla had not produced the confession or resolution he had anticipated. Instead, it had created new questions and deepened existing suspicions. As he reviewed Sir Clive's detailed report of the confrontation, the king realized that more aggressive investigative measures would be necessary. On March 20th, 3 days after the failed confrontation, King Charles authorized the expansion of the investigation to include comprehensive interviews with all staff members who had access to Catherine's office during the relevant time period. He also approved the installation of discreet surveillance equipment in areas where future document tampering might occur, though this decision was made with considerable reluctance given the privacy implications. The expanded investigation was led by Detective Chief Inspector James Morrison of the Metropolitan Police, who had extensive experience with sensitive cases involving public figures. DCI Morrison understood that this investigation required not only technical expertise, but also an appreciation for the unique dynamics and pressures of royal life. Morrison's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a routine interview with Thomas Hartwell, a senior clerk in the palace's correspondence department, Morrison discovered that Hartwell had noticed unusual activity in Catherine's office during late evening hours over the past 2 months. "I work late most evenings," Hartwell explained during his interview, "and I often see lights on in various offices when most staff have gone home. But I began noticing that Her Royal Highness's office was occupied unusually late on several occasions, even when I knew she wasn't scheduled to be in the palace." This information led Morrison to review the palace's electronic keycard records for Catherine's office. What he discovered was shocking. The access logs showed multiple entries to Catherine's office during times when Catherine herself was documented to be elsewhere, at public engagements, at her children's school events, or at her private residence. The key card being used for these unauthorized entries was registered to Victoria Pemberton, Catherine's senior private secretary, who had been with the princess for over 4 years. Victoria was widely respected within the palace for her discretion, efficiency, and unwavering loyalty to Catherine. The idea that she might be responsible for the document alterations seemed almost inconceivable. When DCI Morrison requested an interview with Victoria on March 22nd, she initially appeared calm and cooperative. Victoria was an elegant woman in her early 40s who had built her career on attention to detail and absolute reliability. She had worked for other members of the royal family before joining Catherine's staff, and was considered one of the most competent private secretaries in the royal household. "Miss Pemberton," DCI Morrison began, "we're investigating some irregularities in document processing, and we need to understand the procedures in the Princess of Wales's office during the past few months." Victoria answered the initial questions with professional composure, explaining the office's workflow, security procedures, and her own responsibilities. But as Morrison's questions became more specific, her answers began to show signs of stress. "Can you explain why your keycard was used to access the princess's office on March 2nd at 9:30 p.m. when the princess was attending a school concert in Windsor?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. I sometimes need to retrieve files or prepare materials for the next day's activities. The princess is very demanding about having everything perfectly organized." Morrison pressed further. "What about March 5th at 11:15 p.m. or March 8th at 10:45 p.m.? These seem like unusually late hours for routine preparation." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Victoria stared at her hands, which were trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain control. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. "She never appreciated what I did for her," Victoria said quietly. 4 years of perfect service, of making her look good, of protecting her from mistakes and oversights. But she still treated me like just another employee." Morrison leaned forward, sensing that Victoria was about to provide the breakthrough they needed. "What did you do, Miss Pemberton?" The confession that followed shocked even the experienced detective. Victoria explained that she had been systematically altering documents for weeks, not to help Catherine, but to damage her relationship with Camilla and potentially create a scandal that would reflect poorly on Catherine's judgment and management skills. "I thought that if it looked like Catherine was trying to undermine Queen Camilla, it would create problems for her," Victoria admitted. "I wanted her to face some consequences for the way she treated her staff." The sophistication of Victoria's plan was remarkable. She had used her extensive knowledge of royal protocol and her access to specialized equipment to create alterations that would appear to be the work of someone trying to advance Catherine's interests. In reality, she had been trying to sabotage Catherine by making it appear that the princess was engaged in petty power struggles with Camilla. Victoria's confession solved the mystery of the document alterations, but it also revealed the depth of dysfunction within Catherine's office. As the investigation continued, additional staff members came forward with complaints about working conditions, unreasonable demands, and a lack of appreciation for their efforts. The revelation that Catherine had been framed by her own private secretary sent shockwaves through the palace hierarchy. Sir Clive Alderton, who had been prepared to handle a scandal involving competition between royal women, now faced a completely different crisis involving staff management and internal security. King Charles was briefed on Victoria's confession on the morning of March 23rd. His reaction was one of profound concern, not just about the document alterations, but about the workplace environment that had apparently motivated such extreme behavior. "How did we miss this?" the king asked Sir Clive during their emergency meeting. "How did someone with obvious grievances and access to sensitive materials go unnoticed for so long?" This question would plague palace administrators for months to come. The royal household employed hundreds of people, many of whom had access to sensitive information and materials. The Victoria Pemberton case exposed fundamental weaknesses in staff screening, supervision, and workplace satisfaction monitoring. Catherine's reaction to Victoria's confession was complex. On one hand, she felt vindicated by the proof that she had not been responsible for the document alterations. On the other hand, she was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about her management style and the work environment in her office. "I had no idea Victoria was so unhappy," Catherine told Sir Clive during a private meeting following Victoria's confession. "I thought we had a good working relationship. She never expressed any concerns about her duties or treatment." Sir Clive, who had conducted similar conversations with other members of the royal family over the years, recognized this as a common disconnect between senior royals and their staff. The formal nature of royal service often prevented the kind of open communication that might identify problems before they escalated. The most challenging aspect of resolving the crisis was addressing the damage to the relationship between Catherine and Camilla. Even though Catherine had been cleared of wrongdoing, the accusations and confrontation had created wounds that would not heal easily. Camilla's reaction to Victoria's confession was gracious but guarded. She issued a private apology to Catherine for the accusations made during their confrontation, but those close to her reported that the Queen Consort remained concerned about the workplace issues that had enabled Victoria's sabotage. The fact that Catherine was innocent of the document alterations doesn't change the fact that someone on her staff felt motivated to take such extreme action, Camilla confided to a close friend. That suggests problems that go beyond one disgruntled employee. The Victoria Pemberton scandal, as it came to be known within palace circles, led to comprehensive reforms in royal household management. New procedures were implemented for staff screening, workplace satisfaction monitoring, and security protocols. Regular reviews of staff access to sensitive materials became mandatory, and anonymous reporting systems were established to identify potential problems before they escalated. The media, which had begun to sense that something unusual was happening within the palace, never learned the full details of the document alteration scandal. Official sources described Victoria's departure as a resignation due to personal circumstances, and the comprehensive investigation was characterized as a routine security review. However, royal correspondents noted subtle changes in the dynamics between Catherine and Camilla at public events following the crisis. Their interactions, while still professional, lacked the warmth and easy familiarity that had characterized their relationship in previous years. Dr. Amanda Foster, the royal historian who had been consulted during the investigation, later reflected on the broader implications of the scandal. What the Victoria Pemberton case revealed, she noted in a confidential report prepared for the palace, was that the pressures and isolation of royal service can create unexpected vulnerabilities. The formal nature of royal relationships, even between senior royals and their closest staff, can prevent the identification of serious problems. The long-term consequences of the scandal extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Catherine was forced to examine her management style and make significant changes to how she interacted with her staff. She implemented regular one-on-one meetings with her employees, created more informal communication channels, and brought in external consultants to assess workplace satisfaction within her office. Camilla, meanwhile, used the experience to reflect on the inherent tensions in her relationship with Catherine. She recognized that some level of competition and comparison was inevitable given their respective positions, but she also understood that managing these tensions required more active effort than she had previously invested. King Charles, who had hoped to avoid family drama during the early years of his reign, learned valuable lessons about the complexity of managing not just the royal family, but the extensive household that supported it. He authorized a comprehensive review of palace operations that led to significant reforms in how the royal household was managed and supervised. The historical significance of the Victoria Pemberton scandal lay not in the document alterations themselves, but in what they revealed about the pressures and dynamics of modern royal service. For the first time in memory, a crisis within the royal family had been caused not by personal conflicts between family members, but by the failure to maintain appropriate relationships with staff. Margaret Thornbury, the archivist whose careful attention to detail had first uncovered the altered documents, found herself promoted to a senior position within the palace's document security division. Her role in identifying and reporting the alterations was quietly recognized as exemplary, and she became part of the team responsible for implementing new security measures. In the months that followed, Margaret often reflected on how a routine morning of document review had led to such dramatic consequences. The experience had taught her that even in an institution as stable and traditional as the monarchy, careful attention to detail could uncover problems that threatened the very foundations of royal authority. The Victoria Pemberton case became a cautionary tale within royal circles about the importance of workplace management and staff relations. It demonstrated that threats to royal stability could come from unexpected sources, and that the traditional focus on external threats might miss more subtle but equally dangerous internal vulnerabilities. Years later, when historians examined the early years of King Charles's reign, the Victoria Pemberton scandal would be noted as a turning point in how the royal household managed its internal operations. The reforms implemented following the crisis helped prevent similar incidents and contributed to a more professional and sustainable approach to royal service. For Catherine and Camilla, the experience became a foundation for a more mature and realistic relationship. While they never fully recovered the easy warmth of their earlier interactions, they developed a respectful professional partnership based on mutual understanding of their respective roles and the challenges they faced. The document alteration scandal that had begun with Margaret Thornbury's careful observation of irregular emblems ultimately became a catalyst for positive change within the royal household. It demonstrated that even the most traditional institutions must adapt and evolve to address new challenges and vulnerabilities. The legacy of the Victoria Pemberton case would influence royal household management for years to come, serving as a reminder that the stability of the monarchy depended not just on the actions of the royal family themselves, but on the hundreds of dedicated professionals who supported them behind the scenes.